Tonight's lecture is over biodiversity. Even before his plane landed on the Indonesian island of Sumatra, Laurel Sutherland could tell the scene awaiting him would be worse than expected. They were still 30,000 feet over the Java Sea, and already a sickly haze of yellow smoke seemed to be enveloping the aircraft. The 30-something naturalist and environmental crusader had traveled all the way from California to see firsthand the impact the burgeoning palm oil industry was having on this South Pacific island. Moving on, palm oil rose to prominence as a dietary replacement for trans fats, a type of fat linked to heart disease and other health problems. The oil comes from the waxy orange fruits that sprout from the oil palm trees. It can be extracted from both the flesh and the seed of the fruits and makes up roughly half of the planet's edible oil production. In recent years, it has made its way into the mind-boggling list of consumer products, foods like chocolate, peanut butter, cereal, and biscuits, as well as cosmetics like shampoo, diaper cream, and toilet cleaner. By some accounts, nearly half of all U.S. packaged food and household products contain palm oil, and our palm oil consumption has increased more than eightfold since 2000, reaching 1.4 million tons in 2018. Almost all that palm oil comes from Southeast Asia. Like other areas where oil palm plantations are established, the island of Sumatra, where Sutherland's plane was now landing, suffers from high rates of deforestation. His eyes and nose were assaulted with smoke the instant he stepped off the plane. Sutherland said, "I actually had to suppress an initial panic that I would suffocate from the smoke." In fact, he had been lucky to land at all. Air traffic would be canceled later that day due to poor visibility. Sutherland had stories about the devastation wrought by deforestation, but he was not prepared for what he was about to see. And that brings us to key concept number 1. We have identified only a small fraction of the species that make up the tremendous variety of life on Earth. This variety of life is referred to as biodiversity. We know much more about smaller groups such as plants and vertebrates than more diverse groups like invertebrates. So rainforests, including those being cleared in Indonesia and Malaysia, contain the greatest concentration and variety of plant and animal terrestrial life forms on Earth. This variety is called biodiversity, and it is the most unique and extraordinary feature of our planet. So great is the diversity of life on Earth that it is virtually impossible to know just how many species exist. In fact, many believe the vast majority of all living species have yet to be discovered or identified by humans. Well, if that is true, then how is it in Module 3.1 we estimate that 99% of all species have gone extinct? If we don't know all of the living species and we have no way to discover all of them or identify all of them, then how can we know 99% of all species that have ever lived on Earth have gone extinct? Always be skeptical and always be inquisitive. So far, science has identified around 1.5 million species, and common estimates for the total number of species on Earth range from 3 to 11 million. A highly regarded study estimated the total number of species, excluding bacteria, to be 8.7 million. This estimate was based on the reliable numerical relationship that exists between species numbers and the numbers found in the taxonomic groups above the species level, from genera to phyla. These are categories that are easier to track and count. This is a very large number. Think about how many zeros are on the end of your bank account, and compare that to 2 billion. What we do know is that some life forms are far more diverse than others. There are far more insects than there are vertebrates, for example, and there are relatively few mammals overall. Estimates put mammals at about 5,500 species. We also know that some regions of the world contain far greater concentrations of biodiversity, or megadiversity, than other regions. Indonesia is one such region. It has more species of mammals, parrots, palms, swallowtail butterflies, and coral than any other country on the planet. Roughly 10% of all flowering plant species are found there. A recent census of a 1.3 square mile plot on the Indonesian island of Siberut, for example, revealed 139 different species of trees. Indeed, tropical forests and tropical coral reef ecosystems are the most biodiverse in the world. The Duke University Center for Tropical Conservation reports that a 2.5-acre research plot in Amazonian rainforests contains close to 300 tree species. Compare this to the tree species diversity of the boreal forest that spans all of northern Canada, about 20 species altogether. But habitat destruction and other pressures are threatening this biodiversity on a global scale. So since 1950, more than 560 million acres of tropical forest land have been cleared. That's an area larger than Alaska and California combined. Indonesia alone lost roughly 23 million acres between 2000 and 2017. Much of this deforestation has been to make way for oil palm plantations. Tropical forests in Africa and South America are also being lost to palm oils. Rubber plantations, too, account for significant deforestation in these areas. Globally, around 25 million acres have been converted to rubber plantations. 85% of that is in Southeast Asia. The environmental costs of the clearing of tropical rainforests are expected to be far-reaching. For one thing, such rapid and colossal loss of rainforests contributes to regional and global climate change and is almost certain to accelerate global warming. For much of 2015, Indonesia's greenhouse gas emissions exceeded those of the United States due to the massive forest clearing and fires. For another, forest loss contributes to soil erosion, water pollution, and flooding, not to mention the scarcity of resources on which local human communities depend. Rampant air pollution from forest clearing poses a significant threat to human health in the region. But the most immediate consequences by far will be visited upon the region's wildlife. Fewer than 50% of the species normally found in the natural forest will be found in the oil palm plantations. Mammals, in particular, tend to avoid the plantations. Only about 10% of the original mammalian fauna are typically present. Scientists estimate that converting a forest into an industrial oil palm plantation results in the death or displacement of more than 95% of the orangutans living there. The habitat loss also impacts countless bird, reptile, insect, and plant species, many of which fail to thrive or even return at all because other species on which they depend are gone. Have you ever thought that some of the simple products that you consume, like a candy bar, a jar of peanut butter, a package of crackers, has anything to do with orangutans going extinct? But the link is there. So let's have a look at infographic number 1 on page 124. We have identified about 1.5 million species so far, but our knowledge of Earth's total biodiversity is scant. Even our accounting of, quote, known species, unquote, that is, those described in the scientific literature, is an estimate because some may be erroneously identified as separate species while others go unrecognized as distinct species. Of the species we have identified, insects far outnumber any other group of organisms. Beetles alone account for about 25% of all known species, more than all known or estimated plant species. Vertebrates, the group which humans belong to, likely make up only 1% of all organisms on Earth. And that brings us to key concept number 2. Biodiversity contributes to the health and well-being of ecosystems, which in turn benefits human populations by providing ecosystem resources and services as well as cultural and health benefits. So biodiversity is responsible for much more than the majesty of nature. It provides a wide array of ecosystem services important to all species, including humans. For starters, it provides the key connections between individual species and between species and their environment. These connections help regulate the ecosystem as a whole. Insects pollinate flowers, for example. Photosynthetic organisms, plants on land, algae and phytoplankton in the sea, bring in energy, produce oxygen, and sequester carbon. Other organisms capture and pass along important nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Still others help purify the air and water, and all species eventually become food for other creatures. Water also cycles through living things. In a forest, thousands of gallons a year are captured and passed along by each tree, releasing enough water vapor into the atmosphere to affect local rainfall. Life-giving soil forms as organisms decompose. Soil supports plant life, whose roots in turn hold it in place, keeping it from being washed away in rains or floods. Meanwhile, predators and competitors keep each other in check so that no single species grows too populous or gobbles up too many needed resources. So biodiversity can also provide direct protection against disease in various ways. The incidence of Lyme disease in the United States, for example, is often lower in areas with higher biodiversity, especially areas with squirrels and possums, two species that effectively remove disease-carrying ticks, an action that prevents the spread of the disease to other organisms. Likewise, some recent research showed that fewer human cases of West Nile virus occur in eastern U.S. counties with higher bird biodiversity, possibly because some species are less effective at transmitting the virus than others. The more these species are present, the less likely the virus will be transmitted to humans. The mechanics of that study must be pretty interesting. Furthermore, biodiverse ecosystems have economic value as well. Forests provide not only food, fuel, and building materials, but also pharmaceuticals. People use the chemicals they extract from plants and animals not only as a way to attend to the individual human health needs, but also as a source of income. Roughly half of all modern medicines, including medicine cabinet staples like aspirin and codeine, as well as most hypertension drugs and some cancer-fighting superstars, were originally derived from plants, many of them traditional remedies used for centuries. Over generations, rural forest-based communities in Sumatra have perfected a sophisticated management of forest resources that provides hillsides of coffee, elegant groves of cinnamon trees, acres of terraced rice paddies, and a healthy mixture of fruit trees, vegetables, tobacco, and other useful edible, commercial, and medicinal plants. Biodiversity supplies cultural benefits too, whether it is the enjoyment of a natural area for recreation or aesthetic appreciation or a social tradition rooted in nature. Both cultural and economic benefits of biodiversity are ultimately tied to the ecosystem regulation and support services that a rich community of species provides. Without the many species that keep ecosystems functioning, our ability to extract resources or enjoy nature would be much reduced. In 1997, a study estimated that the annual value of ecosystem services to be worth almost twice the annual gross domestic product of the entire world. Environmental economists have set out to quantify the monetary worth of these services to bring attention to this often underappreciated value. The most recent estimate puts that value at $125 trillion, an amount roughly equal to the GDP of the entire world economy. Even nature-based recreation is a multi-billion-dollar business worldwide. Whale watching, a pastime in more than 80 countries, brings in $2 billion annually. The U.S. Department of Fish and Wildlife Service estimated the economic value of hunting, fishing, and wildlife viewing in 2016 to be more than $157 billion. Unfortunately, the ability of nature to provide these services and meet human needs and wants is declining in almost all of the ecosystem service categories evaluated. Only agricultural resources such as food, fiber, and biofuels have increased in recent decades, but these gains may be lost with further ecosystem damage. Keyword there is maybe. Of course, many people feel that the value of any given species goes beyond the instrumental values, that is, the ecological, cultural, and economic benefits that it brings. Many say that a species like the orangutan has intrinsic value, that is, an inherent right to exist, and is therefore worth preserving regardless of what benefits it might provide. And that brings us to infographic 2 on page 126. We depend on genetically diverse species-rich communities to provide the goods and services we use every day. When biodiversity declines in an ecosystem, its ability to meet the needs of humans and other species is diminished. Moving on, ecosystem regulation and support make the services of human provisions and cultural benefits possible. And that brings us to key concept number 3. Genetic, species, and ecological diversity all enhance the ability of an ecosystem to function and for its members to adapt to changing conditions. So biodiversity can be broken down into 3 types of diversity that really represent 3 different levels of diversity from the population up to the ecosystem. Genetic diversity is the heritable variation among individuals of a single population or within the species as a whole. This diversity at the population level, that is genetic diversity, provides the raw material that allows populations to adapt to their environment, potentially leading to the emergence of new species. Without genetic diversity, even the most well-adapted species could be in danger of facing extinction if conditions change. The importance of genetic diversity was tragically illustrated in 19th century Ireland. At the time, potatoes were the main food source for 1/3 or more of the population. Potatoes grew well in the Irish climate despite the plant not being native to Ireland. It hails from South America on the slopes of the Andes Mountains. Thousands of different genetic varieties of potato plants grew, each adapted to the slightly different niche found at different latitudes and elevations. These traits were selected for by nature and later enhanced with artificial selection by hundreds of generations of Andean farmers. But only a few varieties of potatoes were imported to Ireland, and by the late 1840s, one type was predominantly planted, the lumper. This variety grew well and fed millions until a fungus arrived in the mid-1800s that attacked the potatoes. In the Andes, this fungus damaged some crops, but because all the potato varieties were so different, even when some plants died, others survived. But in Ireland, without genetic diversity in the potato population, what killed one killed them all. The vulnerable lumpers succumbed to the fungus, and the potato crop was wiped out for several years. Between 1845 and 1851, more than 1 million people died of starvation, and 1 million more emigrated, many to the United States. We can also find biodiversity at the community level, that is, species diversity. This is an accounting of the numbers of species living in an area that is called species richness, and their distribution, which is species evenness. Some ecosystems naturally have higher species diversity than others. Areas with high species diversity often owe that variety to their ecological diversity, that is, the variety of habitats, niches, and ecological communities in an ecosystem. Rainforests contain a wide variety of habitats and considerable physical complexity, creating many niches. Each of the many species living in a tropical rainforest occupies an individual niche, and they all contribute to the functioning of the ecosystem, including vital services like energy capture, nutrient cycling, and decomposition. For example, a wide variety of plant species occupy every level of the rainforest from the forest floor to the canopy, each adapted to capture the sunlight available in the forest level where they are found. This large producer base supports many trophic levels and many species within those trophic levels, increasing the efficient use and transfer of nutrients in the ecosystem. Few matter resources go unused. The loss of species or extinction in an ecosystem removes contributing members from that ecosystem, potentially impacting other species and the ability of that ecosystem to function and provide ecosystem services. And that brings us to infographic number 3 on page 128. Biodiversity includes genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. And that brings us to our key concept number 4. Protecting biodiversity hotspots, that is, areas with high numbers of endangered endemic species, can be a cost-effective way to protect many endangered species. So tropical forests tend to be particularly flush with both ecological and species diversity, thanks largely to the abundant sunlight and climatic conditions conducive to growth. The forests that are currently being laid in Sumatra are no exception. They have been left unhampered for so many millennia that these steamy ecosystems swarm with a cornucopia of life: elephants, orangutans, tapirs, tigers, and every manner of bird and beetle the human imagination can fathom. The truth is, no one has any idea how many species used to live in these forests, and half of the species in these forests have yet to be described to science. Since areas with high ecological diversity offer so many unique habitats and niches, they often have a large number of endemic species that are specially adapted to that locale and naturally found nowhere else on Earth. They are most commonly found in small, isolated ecosystems like islands or mountaintops because the species' population members cannot easily disperse and share genes with other populations. Biodiversity hotspots are areas that have high endemism, that is greater than 1,500 endemic plant species, and have lost at least 70% of their original habitat. These areas contain a large number of endangered species. Endangered species are those species at risk of becoming extinct. 36 land and aquatic regions have been designated as hotspots, and many are found in the tropics. The latest biodiversity hotspot to be added to the list is the North American coastal plain. The coastal region from Massachusetts down to the Gulf coast of Texas and northern Mexico, extending up the Mississippi Basin into southern Missouri and Kentucky. With the number of endemic plant species topping 1,800 and having lost 85% of its original natural habitat, it more than qualifies as a hotspot. This region is especially rich in turtle species. 39% of its reptile species are endemic, and amphibians have 47% of its species which are endemic. Because these are pockets of high biodiversity and contain many unique species found nowhere else, biodiversity hotspots are conservation priorities. Investing time and money in protecting these areas can potentially provide a lot of return on investment. Many endangered species or species vulnerable for endangerment will be protected. The island of Sumatra is one such hotspot. It is home, for example, to the endemic Sumatran tiger. The pygmy elephant is likewise endemic to the nearby island of Borneo. And the orangutan, one of humans' closest relatives on the evolutionary tree, is endemic to the region, with different types of orangutan found on islands of Sumatra and Borneo. All of these species are being driven to the edge of extinction by our pursuit of palm oil. And that brings us to infographic number 4 on page 129. Biodiversity hotspots, that is, areas with high numbers of endemic but endangered species, cover a small percentage of land and water areas but hold more than 40 to 50% of all plant and vertebrate endemic animal species. Most hotspots are located in tropical biomes or in isolated terrestrial ecosystems, such as mountains or islands. Even small disturbances, such as a small farm plot or a road that cuts through the area, can threaten endemic species that populate specialized niches in these hotspots. And that brings us to key concept number 5. Isolation increases the risk a population will be lost if conditions change, because it is unlikely individuals from other populations will emigrate, bringing new, potentially helpful genetic diversity to the group. So species come to islands such as Sumatra in various ways. They may be blown in on storms, they may arrive as migrators, or an island may have broken off from a larger landmass at some point. Because these are rare events, once a species arrives, it is unlikely to be joined by other members of its species. The founding population is therefore isolated, and as it adapts over time to its new island home, it may eventually evolve into a new species. For this reason, the number of unique species, that is, the degree of endemism, generally increases with isolation. On the Hawaiian Islands, almost 2,400 miles from the nearest mainland, 90% of the native species are endemic. Their isolation makes remote islands particularly vulnerable to species loss. Their high endemism means these losses represent global extinction events, not merely local extirpations. The smaller the population, often a reflection of the habitat size, the more likely it is that random events such as fires or floods will exterminate the entire group. And isolation reduces the chances of recolonization that might replace lost members or increase genetic diversity. Today, human impact contributes to isolation in the form of habitat fragmentation. This produces habitat, quote-unquote, islands, where before there were larger expanses of uninterrupted habitat. Deforestation that leaves patches of forest may not be suitable for species that need large expanses of forest. Some species, including orangutans, simply will not cross over the deforested patch to disperse from one side of the patch to the other, so the patches effectively isolate them from other parts of their population. Even a narrow or little used road may isolate individuals on one side or the other. Small, completely isolated ecological communities are at the highest risk for species extinction. Large-scale experimental studies show that habitat fragmentation reduces biodiversity by as much as 75%, with significant reductions in biomass and nutrient cycling. Research done by Luke Gibson and colleagues found that after dam construction flooded a Thailand rainforest, leaving behind some small islands covered in forest, almost all mammal species were lost in as little as 5 years on the smallest islands. Isolation can be a recipe for disaster in the face of rapid environmental change. At Duke University, researchers analyzed the fossil record and the living species on the Pacific Islands colonized by humans about 4,000 years ago, and concluded that as many as half of the species might have been driven to extinction after humans arrived. In fact, even though they make up a tiny percentage of the land mass on Earth, islands have accounted for about half of all recorded extinctions in the past 400 years. In Hawaii alone, fully 1/2 of the indigenous flora faces immediate extinction. Such a high extinction rate threatens the fragile tapestry of life on those islands, from the soil and fresh water supplies to the health and economic future of the island's residents. Moving on, wildlife corridors that connect fragmented habitats can be effective conservation tools. Specifically constructed road overpasses or underpasses or ribbons of natural habitat that connect two habitat fragments can allow individuals to travel more freely and are vitally important to maintaining genetic diversity in populations, especially for species that range widely and live at low population densities, such as carnivores like grizzly bears or wolves, or those that live in small family groups like the orangutan. For oil palm plantations, preserving natural corridors around rivers has the added benefits of protecting the water from sediment pollution and reducing the loss of floodplain land by decreasing riverbank erosion. And that brings us to infographic number 5 on page 131. Isolation can increase the number of endemic species in an area because local populations do not share genes with other populations. Over time, an isolated population may diverge from its ancestral population as it becomes adapted to its immediate environment, and we call that speciation. And that brings us to key concept number 6. The leading threats to biodiversity today come from human activities. Biodiversity loss endangers ecosystems and the species, including humans, that depend on the ecosystem services these areas provide. So the world's biodiversity is threatened from many angles. The scientific consensus is that human actions are behind the high extinction rates of the recent past, especially since 1900. The threats include overexploitation, legal and illegal, pollution, anthropogenic climate change, the introduction of invasive species, and the number one cause? Habitat destruction and fragmentation. Globally, and in many regions of the Indonesian rainforest, agriculture is the leading cause of habitat destruction. All these threats are related to the overpopulation and affluence, which lead to greater resource use. In recent decades, despite increasing international attention to the problems of biodiversity loss, each of these factors has become worse. Overfishing has claimed some 85% of oyster reefs and as much as 90% of the world's populations of large predatory fish like tuna and cod. Pesticides and mercury pollution have all but killed off the Mekong River dolphin and imperil many other species of insects, insect-eating birds, and frogs and salamanders. Amphibians are a particularly vulnerable group. Why are amphibians particularly vulnerable? Climate change has claimed the bramble K melomys, a small rodent from Australia, and is threatening to bring the iconic polar bear in the Arctic Circle, not to mention many other species around the world, to disastrous ends. Meanwhile, invasive species are running amok from Alabama to Zimbabwe thanks to international and accidental introductions. And habitat fragmentation is isolating populations and limiting their ability to migrate or disperse to new areas. It is also making commercially viable wildlife, such as elephants with their ivory tusks, more vulnerable than ever to human poaching. Our palm oil obsession is contributing to the leading cause of species endangerment, habitat destruction. By obliterating certain parts of the ecosystem, habitat destruction makes that ecosystem physically less diverse, which then makes it less biodiverse. The loss or even the decline of a species can have significant effects on its ecological community, which in turn can lead to a reduction of ecosystem services. As I've pointed out in many of my live lectures, engineering our way out of this is the best solution. The wildlife corridors that I showed you a few slides ago is an example of engineering our way out of this problem. There are other simple solutions, and maybe some that haven't been thought of yet, and I encourage you to go into the sciences and figure out ways to help our planet survive. Figure out creative ways to carbon capture, to desalinate. Maybe instead of creating solar farms out where they used to grow corn, maybe those should be put on the top of buildings and parking garages and things of that nature. There's quite a bit of surface area in cities that can house solar panels. Think out of the box and come up with solutions, even if it's just in your daily life. The differences between an oil palm plantation and the natural forest it replaced are stark. Biodiversity is severely depleted. As mentioned earlier, large mammals such as orangutans are excluded from areas, but other species are also missing. Only half the bird species will be found there, and studies have shown that insect abundance is reduced by almost 90% in some parts of the forest. The leaf litter that normally converts the forest floor supporters a wide array of species and nutrient cycles they facilitate is much reduced. As much as 95% of ground-dwelling ant biomass may be lost, and the predominant species that remain are not forest natives. The loss of these species and biomass in general negatively affects the ability of the ecosystem to perform ecosystem services. For example, without leaf litter to protect soil, flooding and soil erosion are more likely to occur, increasing the incidence of water pollution. These effects are not limited to tropical rainforests. Ecosystems across the globe, terrestrial and aquatic, have become impoverished as their biodiversity declines. And that brings us to infographic number 6 on page 133. The main threats to biodiversity today come from humans. And as I pointed out earlier, engineering solutions to these problems are our best bet. As opposed to our ancestors who lived in the 1800s, we are now aware of these problems, and we are working to correct them. And this slide shows a more detailed breakdown of the threats. So we see that overexploitation from hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants is the main threat to species that have been accessed so far by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, with agricultural activities a close second. Some of these categories are interconnected. For example, some pollution threats are agricultural in origin, and many of these contribute to habitat destruction. And that brings us to our core message. Biodiversity is important. It provides ecosystem services, food and medicine, recreation, and economic development. Biodiversity is declining. Protecting biodiversity is critical. Okay, let's summarize our chapter. In order for oil producers to adopt better ways, demand will have to come from consumers. Sustainable supplies of palm oil are slowly increasing. In 2015, about 17% of the global supply was sustainably grown, an increase of 11% since 2013. There is still much value in saving these forests. Orangutans still swing freely through the canopies, and new species of lizards and birds continue to be discovered. Engineering solutions is one way humans can improve their usage of resources.